Hello and welcome to today's episode. Today, we're going to be going over a very misunderstood part of commercial real estate. In fact, if you were to ask 100 kind of newer brokers what the hardest part of, or the most misunderstood, or the least clear part of commercial real estate is, and it would be valuing commercial properties, right? Because the way we do things in commercial is a bit different, So if a broker is coming to us, let's say from the residential side, sold homes for a couple of years, always wanted to get into commercial, but just didn't know how, they use a different approach, right? They use comps or comparative sales. So basically, the value of your house is worth more or less in some relation to what your neighbor's house is worth. But in commercial, it's a little bit different. So if you've ever bought, let's say, a residential property, you're familiar with the appraisal process. The value of a home is, like I mentioned, primarily dependent upon the prices of what other homes in the area have sold for. You make some adjustments and so forth, and you can kind of determine the value, right? But commercial real estate appraisal, it differs rather, because and understanding the differences between the two is important, because you want to help your clients on the highest level possible. You have to have a very, very clear vision and be able to articulate that vision or that perspective to your clients, right? Especially when you have a client, let's say, that maybe is newer to investing in commercial. Maybe they own a couple of residential single family homes, let's say, and they want to start getting into buying small apartment buildings. You need to be able to guide your client properly in what a place is actually worth. If not, maybe you do one deal with them, they realize they overpaid for something and they won't use you again. So it's very, very important skill to understand, right? So let's talk about the ways that commercial real estate differs from residential. So what most people don't realize is that, there's a few different ways of valuing properties, right? The least used method is going to be the cost approach. The cost, this is like the cost that's required to build a structure. It's the replacement cost of the property, if you remember that from when you took your licensing classes and so forth. And what it comes down to, the only person or people that are really interested in that is going to be, basically insurance companies. If heaven forbid a flood, fire, hurricane, tornado, whatever came by, and knocked something down, it's the value which the money that would be required in order to replace what was there, right? In most cases, the property, as time goes on, will be more expensive to build than anyone is willing to pay for it. So this is particularly true in lower income areas. Homes in these areas are much less expensive than the replacement cost, right? Because maybe the area doesn't really call for it. But what's most important to understand, right, is there's a few different ways that you can go through and analyze properties, right? There's a few different metrics, right? So some people go through and this is one that's covered, and I just don't know why they do it. If I'm being honest, I heard about it, when I was first coming up, and I have yet to know a sophisticated investor that uses this. Right. So, there's one called the gross rent multiplier. And it's important for you to understand, because not so sophisticated investors want to kind of show what they've got. And they'll be like, oh, well, what's the gross rent multiplier on this property? And the reality of it is they don't know what they're talking about. Right. And I'll give you an example. Right. So the gross rent multiplier is the selling price of the product divided by the gross rents. So if you were to compare the GRM, or gross rent multiplier, of the subject property to comparable properties, you can get an excellent idea of the value of the property that interests you. Not really, because what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to determine in gross rents how long it takes for a property to pay itself off, right? And it's useful, but it's just not the most accurate way of determining value. It gives you kind of like what I call the back of the napkin feel for comparing one property to another, but it doesn't take into account future potential. It doesn't take into account operating expenses, which can vary greatly from one property to the next, right? So for instance, let me give you a perfect example. If a property has a sale price of $1 million and the annual gross rents are now this is top line. This is what just comes in. This is no operating expenses. So if the top line revenue or gross rents are 125,000, the GRM, or gross rent multiplier, would be 8. Okay. Now the thing is, that means that what that says is it would take 8 years of receiving gross rents to pay off that $1 million that you paid for it. Pretty simple, right? If it was $1 million and you had $100,000 coming in, year after year in gross rents, it would be 10, right? Very, very simple. Purchase price divided by the gross rents. Now, here's the problem. The problem with that is, let's say you have two buildings side by side and you're trying to sell both for $1 million. The problem is if you're using gross rent multiplier, what happens is, let's say building A brings in 120,000 and you're selling the building for $1 million and it brings in 120,000 and it has $20,000 of operating expenses. Cool. So you're putting $100,000 in your pocket every year. Okay. Now let's say the building built right next door by the same builder in the same year in the same condition is selling for $1 million. And it brings in also $120,000 a year. But instead of having $20,000 of operating expenses, it has $40,000 of operating expenses. So rather than putting $100,000 in your pocket in scenario A, you're putting $80,000 in your pocket in scenario B. Do you believe there's a difference in the value? Well, if you're an intelligent person, yes, of course. The building that makes less money, all things being equal, is worth less than the building that makes more money, right? But if you were to do a GRM or gross rent multiplier analysis of the two, they would both be $1 million divided by 120,000 equals 8. So they would both have a GRM of 8. So what I'm trying to illustrate to you is it's not the most accurate way. It's a ballpark. It's a way of comparing one to the next, but it's really not accurate. It's like saying, the people that all make $100,000 a year are all have the same net worth. Well, they vary greatly. Why? Because it depends on how much money someone spends, and it's not what you make, it's what you keep. The same exact thing goes in commercial real estate analysis. Gross rent multiplier completely disregards what you are keeping, and it's just talking about what a building is making. Okay, so something to understand. I want to warn people on, because most times when people go through it, when we go through their classes and so forth, that's one of the first things they learn, and to me, it's basically useless if you ask me. Now, sales comparisons are another way of determining the value of commercial properties. This is similar to the appraisal of a residential property, right? Similar properties that have recently sold are compared to the subject property. Now, while banks are concerned with this factor, it's of less importance to investors, because investors are concerned with how their property, like the one they're purchasing, is performing, and than what sold recently. So like in the area, like maybe that building sold for $150 a foot, and that one sold for $160 a foot, and that one sold for $145 a foot. They're all in the same ballpark. But again, it doesn't matter what the price per pound, right? The price per square foot is. It really matters what the building is making, how the particular property is making money. Now, the only difference, the only caveat to what we're talking about is owner-user properties. Now, the thing about owner-user properties is an owner-user property is a property that somebody purchases to run their business out of. Perfect example, a car mechanic, right? Mr. Jones buys XYZ building on 123 Main Street because he wants to fix cars, change their mufflers, change their oil, blah, 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 blah. His main purpose is to purchase this building so he can operate his business, or Mrs. Jones, her business, right? What they're so those properties are going to be valued by the price per square foot. Why? Because the use of owner use versus owner use, that gives you some sort of tangible way of identifying where the relative value lies, like that building relative to others in the area. But you cannot do that with income producing properties, because income producing properties, it's not what they're making, it's what they're keeping, right? So if you were to sell a property that the person that owns it is going to be owning it and occupying it and running a business out of there, then you can use comparative sales like you do in residential. But if you're not, and you're using the income approach, you have to be able to understand what's called the capitalization approach, right? Income capitalization. Now, very, very simple. Income capitalization approach is very, very simple, right? The way you figure out if you've ever heard the term cap rate, right? That's where it comes from. Capitalization, that's where it comes from. So what you do is you need to understand what the net operating income is, and then you apply a capitalization rate. Okay, first question is, how do we come up with a net operating income? And basically, net operating income is nothing more than the gross income minus the operating expenses. And that if you subtract the operating expenses from the gross income, you're going to be left with the net operating income. If you want it in a more like simplistic way, what of understanding it, what you can do is just think of money comes in, okay? It costs money to run the building, so money goes out, and whatever's left over, you apply a cap rate to it. Very, very straightforward. Okay. Now, let's talk about gross income. What is gross income? What's the definition? Gross income is anything, the income from the rents, from parking, that'll be like your rental income. You have additional sources, like I mentioned, parking, coin operated laundry, let's say, it could be vending machines, it could be anything that's different than rent, that is that can be attributed to money coming in. So you have your rental income, you have other income, and you put the two together, and that's going to be, your gross income. Now, if you subtract out what are called operating expenses, then, because every building takes money to operate it, right? What do I mean by that? The grass has to get cut. The building has to get, let's say the sidewalks need to be shoveled after a snowstorm, right? Sometimes the owner pays for the lights in the parking lot, right? Maybe there's a pretty fountain if it's an office building. Maybe they need janitorial supply to clean the common areas and the bathrooms and so forth. So there's a bunch of different things. Management fees, can be an operating expense. The way you can understand and remember what an operating expense is two words, okay? They are regular and recurring. Say it out loud: regular and recurring. And what that means is it's something that happens over and over and over again, whether it's on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, or annual basis, doesn't matter, as long as it's regular and recurring. Like the examples I use: snow plowing, utility bills, property taxes for sure, trash collection, janitorial, anything that happens on an ongoing basis. Might be quarterly, might be annual, might be daily, monthly, weekly, doesn't matter, as long as it's regular and recurring. Now, that's step one. The next part to understand is, because you're going to hear a lot of this, is capital expenses. Those are not something that we take into account when figuring out the net operating income. Those are things that only happen every 5 or 10 or 15 years: changing the roof, changing the parking lot surface, or restriping, changing windows to hurricane grade windows or high efficiency windows, changing air conditioning and heating units. And anything that happens on a yearly or multiple yearly basis does not get included in the operating expenses. Just wanted to let you know. Okay. So what you do is you take your gross income, you take your income from rents and parking, coin up laundry, everything. You add all that up, and that's your total income. Okay. And then you subtract out your operating expenses, all the expenses that are regular and recurring, and you are left with your net operating income once you subtract one from the other. Okay. So now, the value of the property to the investor is the net operating income divided by the desired return. For example, right? So if you desire a 10% return, just for easy math, right? And the net operating income is $100,000, okay? You'd be willing to pay, or your investor would be willing to pay $1 million or less for the property, right? Because if they want a 10% return, it's usually 10% minimum. They'll take more than 10, I promise you, right? But if you're willing to take 10%, that they're willing to pay up to $1 million for that property. Would they want an 11 or a 12 or a 13%? Absolutely. But 10 would usually be their minimum. So whenever anyone says what their desired rate of return is, that's usually the minimum that they are willing to accept, or and conversely, the maximum they're willing to pay for a property. Okay. So when you're talking to an investor, just say, what return would you require to feel that you're getting a good deal, right? And with that question, you can understand like what their investment criteria are. And if they don't know, or they throw out some outlandish number, it's kind of your first indicator that they're not all that sophisticated. So I would be careful to how much time you spend with someone who doesn't know what they're looking to make. If they say, "Oh, sky's the limit," I'd be careful with that. Right. But as we learned, right, the value of $100,000 NOI, or net operating income, based on a 10% rate of return is $1 million, because 100,000 divided by 0.10 or 10% in a decimal format equals $1 million. Okay. So let's take it a step further. What would then be the value of a property with the same NOI of $100,000 if the desired rate of return was 8%? Okay. So again, do the math. $100,000 divided by 8% in a decimal format, which is 0.08. And if you guessed $1,250,000, you'd be correct, because 100,000 divided by 0.08 equals 1.25 million, right? Now, one relationship I want to kind of draw your attention to is that of, that if you notice, at a 10% cap rate, the building was worth to that investor, they were willing to pay up to $1 million, right? But at an 8% cap rate, slightly lower, they're willing to pay a higher number. Instead of $1 million, it's $1,250,000. So when I say to my students, I say value, just like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, value is in the eye of the investor. Two different investors could look at the same building with the same operating expenses, same income, same conditions, same everything, right? And have a very, very different view of the value. Maybe some people think that neighborhood is up and coming, and it's going to be the next thing since sliced bread, next best thing, and they think it's going to just take off in a couple of years. Great, those people are likely willing to pay, be willing to accept a lower cap rate. Because think of it like when you were on a seesaw as a kid. Okay, just so you understand the value perspective. The higher a cap rate, okay, higher the cap rate goes, the lower the price is willing to pay for it. So they're inversely related. The lower the cap rate, okay, the higher the price that person is willing to pay for it. Okay, so cap rate and price, or value, however you want to look at it, are inversely related. So whenever you're thinking high cap rate, okay, you're thinking lower price. Lower cap rate, higher price. Okay, because as you saw, a 10% cap rate was $1 million, and an 8% cap rate was $1,250,000. See how that works? So they're inversely related. Think of two kids on a seesaw. One goes up, the other one has to go down. Okay, so what I wanted to draw your attention to is how the change in cap rate or desired rate of return, but the cap rate is for just a very specific one snapshot in one moment in time, and from going from 10% to 8%. Created a huge difference in the value of the property. That's why it's so important to have investors with a really realistic view of market cap rates, because there's nothing worse than someone says, "Oh, I'll take between a 10 and a 12." Well, guess what? For $100,000 of NOI, right? There's a big swing between what a 10% cap rate investor is willing to pay and a 12% cap rate investor is willing to pay. As you see, from 10 to 8, it made a difference of $250,000 or 25%. That's huge, guys. So just wanted to point that out. So when you start doing a lot of this and you start seeing these small shifts in cap rate, you'll see it makes a huge difference in the price an investor is willing to pay. And guess what? At the end of the day, investors, everything comes down to the price, because that is their primary objective, is the return that they're going to be making, right? So now it's not just all about the numbers, right? Some properties have outstanding long-term tenants while others do not. So are the rents fair? Because you could look at a whole bunch of different things, and let's say, I don't know, Starbucks or McDonald's or Walmart is your tenant. Are those going to be a better tenant than, let's say, a mom and pop that, it's a startup or something like that, So some commercial properties are excellent at encouraging tenants to pay rents above the market rate. But eventually these same tenants will realize the truth and leave when the lease is up. So just be careful, if someone has these rents that are way above market, and you're looking at it, you're like, wait a minute, down the street, they can only get $12 a foot. This guy's getting 16 a foot. Something might be wrong there, right? The other part to consider is realize that you're not just investing in the building, right? You're also investing in the quality of leases, the tenants, and the income, right? A building with long-term successful tenants with these long-terms can be worth more than a comparable building with similar rents but worse intangibles. Like, for instance, bringing back Starbucks as an example, would you be willing to pay more money for a property with Starbucks as a tenant with a 10-year corporate guaranteed lease, or a mom and pop coffee shop with the same exact lease paying the same amount, right? Who do you think is more likely to be here 10 years from now, right? If you said Starbucks, you'd be right. So the stronger the credit, or what's called, if you have a credit tenant in place, or willingness and to an ability to pay, the less risk to the investor, the more the investor would be willing to pay. Okay. That's why if you ever do triple net properties, you'll see like they pay a very low cap rate because like Burger King is not defaulting anytime soon. Starbucks is not defaulting anytime soon. So I want you to understand that consider the income, the expenses, and your desired rate of return when determining the price you're willing to pay for a commercial property. Remember, a commercial property is just a business. The person is buying nothing more than an income stream, right? And it just happens to be securitized, right? Or backed up by a commercial property. So their investors are doing nothing but buying, an annuity, basically, a stream of payments into the future. So the more likely that stream of income is to continue into the future, the higher the price that person is willing to pay. Hope that makes sense, right? So what's a reasonable rate of return, you might ask? Well, that depends, right? There's a couple factors that affect the market rate of return. Now, here's what's cool, right? This is where valuation is like a science and an art, right? Because at a certain point, what you wind up finding is that, yes, 1 and 1 will always equal 2, okay? But then the one variable so the science is income comes in, rents go out, boom, you're left with your net operating income or NOI, okay? But the art is the part where you say, okay, what is the market rate of return, right? Because on the north side of town that's booming and pretty and nice and shiny and new, people are willing to pay a lower cap rate. But on the south side of town, on the other side of the tracks, maybe it's had some rough spots. Maybe the economy got hit hard. Maybe major businesses moved out, whatever it is, right? People in different areas of the same city would be willing to pay, a different cap rate for nonetheless, and from one city to the next city or state to state. So you have to understand what the value of your local area cap rate is, right? So take into account like New York City, right? For a very, very long time, they were like, the cap rates would be like 2.5% or 3%, whereas like a small suburb of, let's say, Atlanta, you might be able to get a 10 or 11% rate of return. Why? Because New York City has a lot of more credit tenants, so stronger leases, and has faster capital appreciation, right? So therefore, an investor that has a higher chance of getting paid in a timely fashion, a higher chance that they're willing to pay a higher number. And also properties that tend to increase over time, the people are likely to pay a higher number in an area where people can buy a building for $5 million today and 10 years from now sell it for 10 million, right? And the rents stay the same, or maybe the rents only crept up incrementally. But what winds up happening is areas that have high commercial appreciation, people will buy them and make virtually no money on them. They don't even care what the income stream is because they're betting on the future the capital appreciation or the future appreciation of the building. So while it's not possible to find a property that generates a 9% rate of return in a submarket where most properties will sell at a 6%, it's not impossible, but it's not likely, right? So whenever something seems too good to be true, oftentimes it is. Sometimes you get a deal. Sometimes you find someone that just wants to get out of a situation. Maybe there's a divorce. Maybe there's a death of a partner or a loved one. Maybe they're moving out of state. Maybe they're retiring, what have you. But most often, it's not that likely. So when you have somebody that, word to the wise for newer agents, when you have someone that you're in a market that, the average cap rate's a 6.5 and they're looking for a 10, I'd be careful to how much time you spend with them, because you could search and search and search all day long and never find a cap rate, a 10 cap rate, right? Like the going rate here in Miami, let's just say it's like around like 7.5, right? 8 or 8. So like you need to understand what you need to do in order to find something like that. Like if that's the average, it should be relatively easy to find, right? But if someone's looking for something way above that, buyer beware, or actually agent beware, the buyer might not be very reasonable, right? So let's say you had a buyer and you're looking for a beachfront property in Malibu, California, right? But their budget's $300,000. Would you spend much time on that person? Or would you try to maybe adjust their expectations, right? Same goes for commercial investment. What I see oftentimes way too much is I get agents calling me and they're maybe like not too seasoned in the business. They're not real sure what they're doing. And they're running around trying to find a unicorn, right? Trying to find a needle in a haystack, something that barely exists, right? So what I would highly recommend is you understand what your local area cap rate is, so that when someone comes to you and says, oh, I want this type of property, if you're working with a buyer, heaven forbid, I'm not big on doing it, but if you happen to be working with a buyer, the best way you can go about it is to know what your local area cap rate is. That way you can, know whether if what they're looking for is reasonable, right? It's like if it was the dead of summer and someone said, I want to find a winter parka, how easy are they going to be to find? But if you're looking for them in December, guess what? They're easy to find, right? So a lot of it has to do with timing. A lot of it has to do with what's going on locally, right? Okay, so now that you can understand what affects cap rate and in the different variables, whether it's what's going on in the local area, whether it's areas that are improving or getting worse, maybe it's the credit tenants, maybe it's the length of the terms, maybe it's because they're corporate guaranteed. All these variables play into cap rate, right? But how do we find out what that local area cap rate is? Okay, there's a few things you can do, a couple little hacks for you guys. I want to give you some real good takeaways today, so with confidence you now understand the formula. You got your gross income, you got your operating expenses, and it's left with your net operating income. And mind you, it gets a little bit more granular than that, but for conceptual, I just want you to understand: money comes in, money goes out. What's left is the NOI, and then you apply the cap rate. How do we figure out what that local area cap rate is? Number one, fastest thing, ask somebody who knows. Go on LoopNet, find an area, whoever has the most amount of listings or has done the most amount of business in that area, find 4 or 5 seasoned brokers and ask them, call them up. Hey, Charlie, this is Christian. I'm kind of new to the area, or I'm helping with somebody I'm not super sure. What are you seeing in terms of cap rate and, the last couple of deals you sold? The last 5 or so deals they sold will give a really good indication of what investors are actually paying for commercial properties in terms of cap rate, right? That's the first place I would start, okay? If you have access to CoStar, now not all of you will, but those of you that work at commercial companies will, you can go into the comps section and see what investment properties have sold for in the last 6 months or so. CoStar, their information's decent. It's not perfect, right? So you just want to get like what I call a back of the napkin kind of value and understanding. So what that'll do is you'll say, okay, this one sold for 6.5, this one sold for 7, this one sold for 5.5, this one sold for 6.25, this one sold for 6.75. Guess what? They're all somewhere around the 6 and change, right? So CoStar is a really powerful tool, and you can break things down by property type, by submarket, by zip code. So going through CoStar, going to the comps section and looking at what's been happening in the last 6 months, that'll be huge for you. Okay. Other thing is you can call a local lender and ask what borrowing rates are. Another way that investors kind of determine the way what they're willing to pay for something is what they can borrow the money for. Right. So what we call like the cost of funds. So in an example where for me to go out and borrow money, I can borrow it at 5%. Okay. But what typically investors want are approximately 2 points above what it costs them to borrow money. So for instance, if you were to borrow money at, let's say, a 5, right? And then you typically be wanting to invest in something about a 7 cap, maybe 6.5, like if you go 1.5 to 2 points above your cost of funds, that's like your margin of error. That's a buffer, right? They call that, like I said, the spread, right? So what I want you to understand is anything less than a 2% spread, the difference between your rate of return and what it costs for you to borrow money, you run the risk of not making enough profit to deem the investment worthwhile. So, unforeseen circumstances could occur that lower your rate of return. Like a tenant could move out, right? You could have trouble collecting. Like, remember we had COVID a couple of years ago, right? You could have a hurricane, an earthquake, flood, anything. All these things can happen. And what will happen is if tenants move out, if it makes it harder to rent, whatever, right? You need to have at least that 2% buffer above your cost of funds to account for risk. Because if not, no one likes to borrow money at 5% and then earn money at 5%, because then you've taken on risk and there's no reward. That doesn't make for a successful investor, right? But once you go through those 3 different steps, calling a local lender, calling local brokers, and then checking on CoStar, you're going to have a real good idea of what's happening in your local area. Okay. And once you determine the market cap rate for your market, you'll be able to know exactly what a property should be selling for. And this will help educate your clients, because clients oftentimes, they don't know what they don't know. We do this every day, all day. They don't. So they might have bought a building 3 years ago. And guess what? With what's been happening in the last 3 years, prices have gone through the roof. So they might not be attuned to the market. But if you let them take the lead, they're going to get a number stuck in their head, and it happens all the time. I want a 7 cap. I want a 7 cap. And guess what? The market might only be at 5.5, and they're not going to get their 7 cap. So it's up to you to know this stuff and be able to articulate that to them so that they can understand, oh, wow, okay, well, I maybe I need to adjust my expectation or wait. Either way, it saves you time. If they wait, you're not going through things over and over and over again with them. And if you adjust their expectations, you're much more likely to be able to find something that's reasonable and something that's in the market. Nobody likes to pay market, but guess what? Market today is not market tomorrow. So in the rearview mirror, everything looks cheap. So I hope this works for you guys. I hope this helped you kind of understand some of the different valuation things. So again, going back to it, we talked about the gross rent multiplier. Gross rent multiplier, it's really not that valuable. It's important that you understand how it works, but it's also important for you to understand how it doesn't work. Okay. The next thing we went over was the cost approach, basically what insurance companies need in case that a house gets blown down or a building gets blown down during a hurricane or tornado, what have you, right? We went over comparable sales and how what it does is it is used for owner users. Okay, so you can compare one building to the next because owner users are utilizing the building for themselves instead of as an investment. And then finally, when we went over the capitalization or income approach, the income capitalization approach, where you find out how much a building makes, find out how much a building spends, what's left over is the NOI, and then you apply the local area cap rate. Guys, if you have any questions about this, if this was helpful for you, by all means, leave a comment below. And if you'd like to learn a bit more about this, feel free to reach out to us. We have a Facebook group. It's called Commercial Sales for Agents. Feel free to reach out to us there, or you can reach out on the following. You can find us on TikTok, which is Commercial Sales for Agents. And you can also find us, like I said, on our YouTube channel, which is also Commercial Sales for Agents. Hope this helps you guys. And if there's anything we can do, comment below. If you're interested in learning a bit more about our training, we help train students and understand these concepts so they can go out into the world and be successful listing agents making a lot of money in commercial real estate. So if that's you, go ahead and leave a comment below and we'll be sure to get back to you. Thanks so much. I hope you're having a great day.